Council, please approach. stipulated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Ms. Lamont, you may continue.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Marte. I wanted to clarify a few things with you. You said, talking about Jodi working in 10 different restaurants, right?
Yes.
You're aware that that was over a time of 15 years, right?
She indicated that I asked her how many restaurants she had worked in, and that was the number she gave me.
So you're aware that this was over 15 years?
My understanding is that she worked with her father up until around the age of 18. It may have been 17, and then after that it was 10 restaurants.
So you're aware that the 10 restaurants was during a time period of 15 years. Do you know this or not?
It wasn't over 15 years. It was over, that would have been 8 years. As I just indicated, she worked with her father until 18, or somewhere around there.
Okay, so you think it's just a period of 8 years?
Whatever, 18 until she was incarcerated, yes.
All right. And during this time, you know that these restaurants, that these different restaurants that she worked at, were also, she was working at more than one at a time, right?
I'm not aware of that.
You didn't get that information in your interview with her?
Correct.
And when you told us about some of the suicide ideation, and you used as a data point the fact that she mentioned suicide to her mother, you remember that?
Yes.
You didn't tell us that when she mentioned suicide to her mother, that was actually after June 4th, 2008, right?
I believe it was after.
Okay, so you're considering as a data point something after the trauma that she suffered?
Absolutely. Looking at a pattern of behavior.
Okay, and so you're going to look at then information when you're trying to diagnose borderline, you're going to look at information that occurs after a traumatic event.
Yes, because personality is stable.
All right, and so even though the DSM tells you not to do that, right?
The DSM does not say not to do that.
Didn't you agree with me earlier that the DSM tells you that if you're looking at borderline personality, you need to look at a pattern from the beginning, and if there's a traumatic event, you want to make sure that this pattern is before the traumatic event, right?
No.
No, that's not what it says?
No.
So then you didn't agree with me before.
Restate your question so that I could be clear about what you're asking.
When you're talking about diagnosing borderline personality, okay? Don't you need to make sure that you're looking at a pattern throughout the person's life, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and if you're looking at a pattern throughout the person's life, when there is a trauma, when that person goes through a trauma, don't you want to make sure that the pattern exists before the trauma?
Yes.
Okay. You talked about her going from boyfriend and boyfriend and having this strong attachment, right?
Yes.
But you didn't talk about the fact that when she broke up with Mr. McCartney, she was single for 14 months before she even started dating Mr. Brewer, right?
That wasn't my understanding.
Oh, you didn't know that?
My understanding was that right after Matt, she was dating Daryl.
So you didn't clarify that with her then in your interview?
No, that's the information that I received.
Not from Miss Arias, though.
I can reference my notes if you'd like.
Sure. Do you have those with you, or do you need
They're
them?
right here.
They were, okay.
Consistent with what I just said.
So it's consistent then that she broke up with Mr. McCartney in September of 2001?
She told me that, I don't know those exact dates that she broke up.
Okay. Well then, are you aware that she didn't start dating Mr. Brewer until November of 2002?
I could tell you what she told me.
Okay, but that's all you can tell us, right? Because you spent 12 hours with her, right?
I did spend 12 hours with her.
And you never went back to clarify any information with her, right?
That it wasn't a point of confusion for me.
Sure.
So I didn't need to go back and clarify it.
So you didn't feel that there was any confusion on your part at all?
Right. My notes were very clear about the timeline of what she dated.
Okay, and your notes were done in just a period of the 12 hours that you spent with her, right?
Yes.
So in that 12 hours then, you somehow think that she went directly from Mr. McCartney and started dating Mr. Brewer immediately. That's what you think?
Not somehow, that's what the information I was given.
That's what you are basing your opinion on, right? That's what you think?
Yes, based on the notes I received.
Well, you didn't receive those notes. You wrote those notes, right?
That's correct. Yes,
Okay.
I wrote the notes.
You talked about having this strong attachment partly due to the fact that she moved to Mesa, right? Even after June of 2007.
That would be one indicator, yes.
Okay, but you didn't talk about the fact that she moved away from Mr. Alexander in April of 2008, didn't she?
Yes.
And she moved away to a whole nother state, didn't she?
Yes.
And that in her journal entry, she talked about moving on, right?
Yes.
And she tried to move on by joining a dating service, LDS LinkUp, right?
I wasn't aware of that.
Oh, you didn't know that?
No.
It was in her journals. You didn't read that?
I read her journals.
But you don't remember it then?
I don't remember a specific dating website, no.
Okay. So you don't remember then that she was attempting to meet other people?
I was aware of that.
Okay. And that she was doing this in April and May of 2008, after she moved away from Mr. Alexander?
I was aware that she was trying to date other people, yes.
That she was moving away from Mr. Alexander, right?
Yes.
When we talk about calling, the fact that Mr. Alexander called her names, you know that this started in January of 2007 when he called her a skank, right?
Yes, that's what she told me.
And then he tried to pretend like he was just kidding, right?
I don't know if tried to pretend. She told me that he indicated that it was a joke.
Okay. So he then told her he was just kidding, right?
That's what she told me, yes.
And you know about this situation too, because this is something that you would have read in the emails between Mr. and Mrs. Hughes to Mr. Alexander, right?
Yes.
And they're discussing their concern about the way that Mr. Alexander was treating Jodi, right?
Yes.
And you know from your review of the record, there's no question about the fact that Mr. Alexander had called Miss Arias names like whore, right?
Yes.
And he's called her names like slut.
Yes.
And just because he calls her these names, that doesn't make it true, right?
Doesn't make what true?
That doesn't make it true for him to call her this name. You wouldn't just accept the written word that it must be true then, right?
That what must be true?
That she's a whore? If he calls her a name, do you think that that means it's necessarily true?
If he calls her a name, that's just what he called her. That's what is true, that he called her that.
Okay. And you would consider that abusive, wouldn't you?
For going back to the word abuse, meaning the misuse of something, so it was a misuse of words. So I would say in that situation, yes, it was a misuse of words.
Okay, so if somebody called someone you know or you love a whore or a slut, you would just tell them that's a misuse of words, right?
I'd say that's inappropriate.
Okay. And despite knowing that there is this name calling that's going on and escalating throughout the relationship, you would still not term this as a pattern of verbal abuse, right?
That's correct.
And you would make that opinion based on the fact, or despite the fact, that you are not a domestic violence expert.
I've worked with a lot of people who have experienced domestic violence.
But you told us yesterday that you are not a domestic violence expert, right?
I did based on the idea that I do not have a license in domestic violence.
What license is there in domestic violence?
That's exactly why I said that. There is no license in domestic violence. I told you that I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and I'm an expert as a clinical psychologist because my definition, expert is license.
You agree? Are we going to go back to this?
Sure.
The fact that you're saying that somebody needs to be licensed to be an expert in domestic violence?
No, I was asking you what your definition was and you didn't provide one for me. My definition would be licensure indicates someone has an expertise in that area, and that's
so
what I
anybody
define.
who doesn't have a license in something means that they're not an expert. Is that what you're telling me?
It depends on the definition.
Okay, so according to your depending on a definition now,
Yes.
you're taking it back that you think you are an expert in domestic violence? Is that where we're going?
Yes, I have a lot of experience in domestic violence.
Okay, so yesterday you were not an expert in domestic violence, but now today you are.
I just gave you an example of why I said that, or not an example, I gave you the reason why, that I was basing it on licensure status. I indicated that I have a license as a clinical psychologist.
So the fact that there is no license that a person can get to make them an expert in domestic violence, you would still say that somehow you're not an expert because you don't have this license, it doesn't exist.
That's the criteria I was basing it on when you asked me that question.
Okay, so the fact that you don't have a license in domestic violence, a license that doesn't exist, that's why you're not an expert?
That's what I was basing it on.
Okay, so somehow if this magical license somehow appears and you are able to receive a license in domestic violence, then you can become an expert. Is that what you're telling us?
Based on the criteria that I was conceptualizing it, yes.
And as we speak right now, there is no such thing, right?
That's correct.
On January 24th, 2008, there was a journal entry. I'm showing you Exhibit 511. You talked about this. This is 2 days after Mr. Alexander threw Miss Arias down and broke her finger, right? January 24th?
She just told me,
That is in evidence.
she indicated to me it was in January of 2008.
So you don't know the specific date?
Right.
Okay. But yet you were asked questions about the fact that on January 24th, she writes that there's nothing noteworthy to report, right?
Yes.
And you consider that to be a data point?
Yes.
Isn't it also a point of data that on the same day she talks about the fact that she cannot marry Travis, right?
Yes.
And the fact that she can't quite put her finger on it, but something is just off with that boy?
Yes.
And she also talks on that same day that we all have got head problems, that's for sure, but there are certain things that will never sit right with her, right?
Yes.
All right, earlier, you told me that you conducted the MMPI, right?
Yes.
And a computer scored it for you?
Yes.
And when the computer scored it, it created a report, right?
Yes.
And in that report, that's something that you reviewed, the report?
Yes.
And you determined it to be accurate?
Yes.
And you gave me that report earlier, right?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to show you Exhibit 631. Can you flip through there, please, and tell me, is that the report that you received from the MMPI when you had it scored?
Yes, I'm assuming this is the one I gave you. Yes.
It is. Well, just make sure. I mean, is that it?
Yes, it looks like it.
Okay. And this report is accurate, right?
Yes.
And does it look complete to you?
Yes.
And these are the results that you used in making any opinions about this case, right?
Correct.
Judge, at this time, I'd move for that evidence to be entered. Exhibit 631, I think.
Yes.
No objection.
631 is admitted.
All right, so we're looking at the MMPI. Now that we're going to look at some charts. And we've talked a lot about scales, right? It measures different, it has different scales on this test.
Yes.
And on the left-hand side of this chart, we're looking at page 2. On the left-hand side of this chart, this is the validity scales, right?
Yes.
And then the right-hand side of the chart is the clinical scales.
Correct.
And the validity scales tell us, you know from looking at those numbers in that charting, that this is a valid this is a valid test, right?
Yes.
There were no issues with it.
Right.
All right, and then let's take a look at the scales on the right for a second. You see where it says D?
Yes.
What's that?
Depression.
All right, and depression, we see it going over this line here, right?
That's correct.
That line is set at 65,
That's correct.
and that's the clinically significant line, right?
Yes.
So we're looking at then D for depression, and that is far above the clinically significant line, isn't it?
Yes.
And let's take a look at PD. Can you tell us what that means?
Psychopathic deviant.
Okay, and we know that these scales are further broken down, aren't they?
Yes.
And we give explanations of how they're broken down later on page 8, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we see psychopathic deviant subscales, right?
Yes.
And so some of the things that's going to make this scale elevated is familial discord,
Yes.
right? Authority problems.
Yes.
And we know at the time that this MMPI is given that Jodi's in custody, right? She's
Yes.
been arrested.
She was.
And social alienation, self-alienation, right?
Yes.
And you're aware, given your experience that you've told us that you have, that having a highly elevated scale in PD is often elevated in victims of abuse, right?
It's sometimes elevated, yes.
And that's something that is elevated too when that you know that they're elevated when people are victims of trauma.
It can be elevated with victims of trauma because oftentimes they become perpetrators themselves.
It can be elevated when they're victims of trauma, right?
Yes.
That's what I asked you.
Sometimes, yes.
Well, and you know that in your experience that you're telling us that you have, right?
And I'm telling you that sometimes, yes.
All right. Now, there's more scales than just the ones that we're just looking at here on page 2, right?
That's correct.
If we look at page 4 and we look at the restructured clinical scales, we talk some more about some of the different scales that are measured, right?
Right.
Right.
If you might reference my report, these are not scales that I interpret.
So you didn't look at these?
These are not ones that I interpret because they do not have as much research backing to them.
So when you say you didn't interpret it, does that mean that you didn't look at these?
They're not something I considered. That's correct.
Oh, okay. So you didn't use any of these scales other than page 2?
Other than page 2? No, I
The
used...
one that we just looked at.
That's incorrect.
So you did look at other scales?
Yes, other scales.
Just not this one?
Right. This doesn't have as much research backing to it. The common protocol is to examine the clinical scales, the content scales, and supplementary scales as I highlighted in my report.
Okay, well, we'll look at those too, but let's take a look at this one for right now. We're talking about, let's see, we see LPE. Can you tell us what that is?
These aren't scales that I typically interpret. These aren't things that I've taken in consideration or looked at.
So you can't tell me what LPE is?
I can't give you an interpretation on these. I've not spent time looking at them.
So you don't know what LPE means? That's what I'm asking you.
Not off the top of my head.
Okay, well, we'll go down here. So it actually has it. So LPE, low positive emotions, right?
Okay?
All right, and we see that LPE, that's above the clinical significant level, isn't it?
Yes.
And we see that it is a T-score of 70, isn't it? Whoops. Right there?
Looks like it, yes.
And low positive emotion, that means basically the opposite of self-esteem, doesn't it?
These are scales that I do not commonly use. I'm not going to interpret anything that I did not interpret in this case.
Well, are you telling me that you don't even know what low positive, what LPE means?
I'm telling you that I do not use these scales at all.
So you don't know what it means at all?
Right, I do not use this at all. It's not part of the standard protocol.
Even though the computer, when you score it, it comes back, it tells you what this information is, doesn't it?
Right, but it's my job as a psychologist to determine what has the most empirical backing to it.
And you choose not to use this one, right?
I did for every case.
Oh, for every case, okay.
Yes.
Well, let's see what we can figure out on, let's see what we can figure out then, okay? So LPE, we know, is low positive emotions. Are you telling me that you don't know what low positive emotion means?
What I'm telling you is that the descriptor on the MMPI, the actual labels, are not always indicative of what they actually interpret to mean.
So what you're telling me is that you don't know what low positive emotion means as to the MMPI?
That's correct.
Okay. How about the content scales? Do you know what these are?
Yes.
All right, so on the content scales, We see an ANX, what's that?
Anxiety,
All right, and anxiety, that's elevated, right?
yes.
And that's at a T-score of 76, right?
If you could
Can
move
you
it up a
see?
little bit, thank you. Yes,
All right, and again, the clinical level at this point is 65, right?
correct.
And so we see that her anxiety is elevated, right?
Yes.
And then DEP, what's that?
Depression,
And we see that depression is elevated, isn't it?
yes.
And we see BIZ, what's that?
Bizarre mentation,
Bizarre thoughts? What did you say?
yes. Bizarre mentation,
Okay, which means bizarre thoughts, is that right?
that's a simplistic way of putting it, yes.
Okay, and so in the simplistic way, bizarre thoughts are also elevated, right?
That's correct.
And because of your background and your experience, you know that these three things, anxiety, depression, and bizarre thoughts, those three things often are associated with trauma, aren't they?
Amongst other things, yes, they are.
And ASP, what's that?
Antisocial.
Personality, right?
To get the exact verbiage, I'd be happy to refer to my notes. May I do that?
Sure, do you have notes on the MMPI in there?
I've already given them to you.
Oh, well then, what else do you have to refer to?
I can show you. They're already in, I gave it before.
Do you need me to get them marked?
Sure. Just have the list of the scale names. I don't know what number it was.
Oh, I don't know that.
I gave it. Put this away.
I guess, are you looking for something that tells you what ASP is?
I just want to make sure I'm using the correct verbiage, just it has the titles of them.
Okay. Do you disagree? It's antisocial personality, isn't it?
If I could look to verify that.
Sure.
This one only has the highlighted ones. Yes,
So antisocial personality, right?
I believe so.
Okay. And antisocial personality, that is below even average, isn't it?
Yes.
And then let's take a look at LSE. Do you know what that is?
Low self-esteem.
All right, and that one you know means the opposite of high self-esteem, right? There's no question on that one.
There is. That one's broken down into two, which you can see later on if you keep turning the page.
That it's what?
It's broken down into two, like you highlighted earlier with the Harris Lingos.
Okay, do you want to look at those?
Sure.
Okay, so let's take a look at low self-esteem, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that's broken down into self-doubt
Yes.
and submissiveness, right?
Yes.
So the low self-esteem that we see on this scale,
Is low self-doubt, which is self-concept.
well, we just saw that it was broken down, right?
Right. And the self-doubt is self-concept, identity.
Okay, let me just be clear about this.
Sure.
All right. So we're looking at low self-doubt and submissiveness, right?
That's correct.
And that's how they're broken down.
Yes.
And then we're looking at T-scores. So you're looking at 68 for the self-doubt and 60 for the submissiveness.
Correct.
Can you tell us what A and G means?
Anchor.
Anger. And that is, that anything we need to know? Okay. All right, anger. And we see anger at average, right?
Yes.
Below clinically significant.
Yes.
And in fact, let's take a look at the anger subscales.
That would be an inappropriate use of the MMPI.
Well, let's take a look at them anyway.
They're non-interpretable.
We're looking at anger subscales. We look at explosive behavior, right? Is that a yes?
Yes,
And we look at irritability, right?
yes,
And on both of those, so as a total on the anger subscale, she scored at normal, right? Normal range.
on the anger subscale, yes,
Well, on the anger scale together, right?
yes.
All right, do you know anything about the supplementary scales?
Yes.
All right. Okay, let's talk about A. What's A?
Anxiety,
All right, and in that one, she's elevated in anxiety, isn't she?
correct.
And let's see, we have R. What's R?
I believe R is repression,
Repressed or blocking unpleasant thoughts, right?
yes,
And we have that's showing not to the clinical amount, but it's above normal, isn't it?
still below the clinical threshold,
It's above normal, right?
yes.
And then ES, can you tell us what that is?
I believe it's ego strength,
Okay, and ego strength, that's actually far below normal, isn't it?
yes,
So that would mean the ego strength, or having ego strength, that means it's not very much. There's not very much there, right?
below average,
And what's DO?
I believe that's dominance,
Okay, and when we're talking about dominance, that also actually, dominance, that's also very low, isn't it?
it is.
Below normal, right?
It's below the clinical threshold, yes.
Well, it's below the clinical threshold, but it's also below average, isn't it?
Yes, it's below 50.
And PK, what's PK?
PTSD,
PTSD, oh, PTSD, and PTSD is actually elevated, isn't it?
yes,
And it's elevated to 77, isn't it?
yes,
So that's above the clinical line, isn't it?
yes.
OH, can you tell me what OH means?
I believe OH has, it's a alcohol scale.
Actually, isn't it over-controlled hostility?
I would need to reference the manual to have the exact terms. It's not typical to interpret under the threshold.
Do you have the manual to be able to find out what it is? Unless you want to just accept that it's over-controlled hostility. Do you think that's wrong?
I would like to be specific. I do have the manual.
You do? Okay, go ahead and you do or you don't?
I do.
Okay, go ahead and look at it then. Tell us what OH means.
Over-controlled hostility.
Okay, all right, so let me know when you're finished.
Okay. I'm finished.
Okay, so OH then is over-controlled hostility, right?
Correct.
So it just said, and that is also below average, isn't it?
Yes.
And again, with this scale, we're starting to see a pattern, aren't we, of anxiety, right, and low self-esteem?
No, I don't see that pattern. With low self-esteem?
Yeah, you've seen anxiety on more than one scale now, haven't you?
Anxiety, yes.
Okay, and now we've seen low ego strength, and we've seen the low self, right?
Which was low self-concept,
Yeah.
which is identity disturbance.
No, I'm talking about low self-concept having,
I explained earlier what that meant, what that means.
we talked about it meaning self-doubt and submissiveness, right? That's how these scales are subscaled.
If you look over to the T-score, you'll see that only self-doubt is elevated, not submissiveness.
Well,
And
submissiveness is elevated above normal, right?
It's not interpretable, you're interpreting it improperly.
I'm not interpreting it, I'm telling you
You are
that
by
it's,
saying
I'm,
that.
I'm asking you the question.
Okay.
It's above normal, isn't it?
It's not above the clinical threshold.
I didn't ask you that. I asked you if it was above average.
It's above 50.
Yes, and average is 50, right?
Yes,
So it's above average.
yes.
Okay. And so when we talk about low self-esteem, we're talking about self-doubt and submissiveness, right?
According to
Generally speaking, when we're talking about low self-esteem or low self-esteem subscales, we're talking about self-doubt and submissiveness.
yes, and
Okay.
remember that the label doesn't go with the description. Self-doubt means a poor sense of self, identity disturbance.
Okay, and then we see on the next scales, we see that we've seen depression, right?
Yes,
And anxiety, right?
yes,
And we've seen low scales in dominance. Yes?
yes,
And these are all associated, I'm sure you know, with battered women, right?
all what? Anxiety, depression?
Anxiety, depression, low self-image, low self-esteem.
Those are things you can see in battered women.
Yes. And these are all things that we're seeing on Jodi's scales, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us what AGGR is?
As I highlighted earlier, there are three scales that I interpret: the clinical, content, and supplementary. Those are the ones that have the most empirical backing
Can you
to
tell
them.
us what AGGR means?
No, these are not
Okay,
scales that
so
I've used.
you don't know what it means.
I know what it means, but this is not, I didn't use it in my
I
interpretation.
asked you what it means.
I believe it means aggression.
Yes, it does mean aggression. So, and when we look at aggression on this scale, it is a T-score of 38, right?
That's correct.
And so it is graphed far below the clinical significance scale, right?
Below clinical significance.
And it's below even normal.
Yes.
So when we look at these scales on the MMPI, what we're looking at is the fact that we've seen a high level of anxiety, right?
Yes.
And we've seen high levels of depression.
Yes.
And we've seen low self-esteem.
Yes.
And these are all symptomatic of PTSD, aren't they?
Those are some symptoms seen in PTSD amongst other disorders. Yes.
So you see these symptoms in PTSD, don't you?
You can. Yes.
You do, don't you?
You can.
So somebody with PTSD might not have these,
Correct. Like depression, for example.
but they're going to have anxiety, aren't they?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so let's be specific.
Sure.
You see these things most often when you have a PTSD patient. You tend to see these things, don't you?
No, not all of them.
You don't see them. So
No.
you're telling me when you have a PTSD patient, you don't see anxiety.
Anxiety, yes.
All right, and so they're not always depressed?
That's correct.
Okay, and they don't always have low self-esteem,
That's correct.
according to you, right?
According to me.
All
Those are
right.
my patients that I've seen.
And meanwhile, on the other hand, when we look at Jodi's MMPI scores that you did, we see that we don't see any hostility on the scales, right? The over-controlled hostility, that was low, wasn't it?
Can I interpret what that means?
No, I'm asking you that you saw it on the scale and
You're
it was low,
misinterpreting
right?
it. Yes.
And we saw that it was also low on aggression, right?
Which scale?
On the last one that we just looked at.
The ones that I don't interpret. I can't give an interpretation on that.
The ones that you don't know about, is that what you mean?
No, the ones that are empirically validated enough to use.
Okay, so the ones that you choose not to use, right?
That's standard.
You're aware that other psychologists use these scales, right?
Most psychologists follow the standard that I do. It's common practice.
Okay, you think most psychologists don't use these scales, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, nevertheless, just humor me for a second. You saw aggression, right? And you saw that it was below the clinical significance, right?
I did see that.
And you also saw that dominance was also below the clinical scale
I did.
and below normal, right?
Yes.
And having low hostility, low aggression, and no dominance, those are also characteristics of a battered woman, aren't they?
Not necessarily.
So in your experience, you don't see that in battered women?
Not necessarily.
And in your experience with trauma, you see these in trauma, don't you?
What aspects specifically?
Trauma victims?
What aspects specifically?
Having low hostility and low aggression?
Have I seen that in trauma victims?
Yes.
I've seen it in some and not in others.
And you've seen that these are also characteristics of PTSD, right?
Sometimes it can be, yes.
Again, sometimes. So these characteristics you have seen in your practice associated with PTSD, is that right?
Which ones in particular? You just
The
listed off
same
several.
ones that I'm talking about. No hostility, no aggression, no dominance.
Do I see that in trauma victims?
No, PTSD I'm talking
In
about.
PTSD?
Yes.
Do I see no aggression in PTSD?
Do you tend to see people with low aggression?
You're talking about characteristics that are not directly associated with the disorder. You're going back to differences in people. Everybody is different. One person with PTSD may look different than someone else with PTSD.
Well, if everybody's different, then why would we bother using any of these scales at all?
Because those aren't specific to PTSD. The MMPI is specific to personality characteristics in general psychopathology, not
Right.
specific to PTSD.
So when we're looking at personality, concepts of personality, what we just went through is the fact that Jodi's concepts of personality, we see a we see low hostility, don't we? On these scales that you administered.
Yes,
And we see low dominance, right?
yes.
And low dominance means passiveness, doesn't it?
I would have to look at exactly how the MMPI defines it. Would you like me to do that?
No. Dominance. Dominance means that you dominate over somebody. Can you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. And when you are not dominant, the opposite is passive, right?
You're again making the assumption that the name of the scale is exactly what it measures, and that's not always the case on the MMPI.
And you don't know, right?
I'd
Is
be
that what
happy
you're
to
telling me?
look at it. She didn't elevate on that scale,
She did not.
right? So that's not something that I interpreted.
Right. So in other words, you only looked at her elevated scales.
That's what's clinically significant, yes.
Okay. So the fact that she was not elevated in things like aggression and dominance and hostility, that was not important to you.
Research doesn't support low
I'm
elevations.
asking you a question, Dr. DeMarte. I just want you to answer the question.
Okay, can you ask that again, please?
Yes. The fact that she was low in hostility, low in aggression, and low in dominance, that was not important to you. Is that what you're saying? You didn't interpret it, right?
I did not interpret it.
Okay. Thank you. Nothing further.
Redirect.
Ma'am, one of the things that, if I could have this, please. Ma'am, one of the things that you were asked about was this issue about feeling compassion. Do you remember being asked about that?
Yes,
And do you remember being asked about whether or not, when you conducted these evaluations involving kids and women, whether or not you felt compassion? Do you remember that?
yes.
And do you remember what your answer was as to whether or not you did feel compassion?
I said that I can feel compassion, but I don't walk in feeling compassion.
And as a result of this compassion that you may feel involving kids, did you bring them lollipops and presents?
No,
Why not? You felt compassion.
that crosses the ethical guidelines. It's
What does that
inappropriate.
mean? It violates the ethical guidelines.
It means that that would make me engaging in inappropriate ethical behavior, and that's not something that I want to do.
What about when you walk into these evaluations and you feel this compassion, do you apologize to the individual when you walk in? Do you?
I do not.
Why not? Don't you feel compassion?
Not when I walk in.
I understand that when you walk in, but why don't you apologize anyway?
It's part of the protocol of what we typically do when we do these evaluations. You just don't walk in and apologize. It would
What?
make me biased.
And with regard to apologizing, giving gifts and this sort of thing, is that indicative of any bias to you?
Yeah.
Is it?
Yes.
And what does bias do when you become involved in this kind of situation where you're evaluating somebody?
Causes you to start just looking for variables that are supportive of whatever that bias is.
What do you mean variables that are supportive of whatever that bias means? That's
You
up here. What are you talking about?
start to filter out information that may suggest something otherwise against your bias.
So does that mean that you could skew a result?
Yes.
Now, the other thing that you were asked about was this email involving Travis Alexander and Sky Hughes. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And do you remember being asked about that email, whether or not Mr. Alexander had some positive things to say about the defendant? Do you remember that?
Yes.
Let's take a look at those emails. Now, you were asked about this, and something about the comment that they don't get any more honest than Jodi. Do you remember something like that?
Yes.
With regard to this particular email, take a look at it. It's 589. What date are we talking about?
This was January 29th of 2007.
Do you know that they actually became an item boyfriend and girlfriend in February of 2007?
I am aware of that.
So what does that tell you, that he is saying that before they became boyfriend and girlfriend?
It's telling me that he had fond feelings of her prior to them deciding to become an official couple.
At that time, do you know whether or not they said they had the same history that they had back in May of 2008 when these words were being thrown around?
No.
So presumably, do you have any indication that these words that we've been talking about occurred before January of 2007?
No.
And how about these other indications that we have, that you've talked about getting into the Facebook account, the email account? Do you have any indication that that had happened before January of 2007? That she went into his Facebook account?
Not before that time.
And you were also asked about this indication from Mr. Alexander about him being extremely frightened because of the defendant's stalking behavior. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And you were asked, well, did you look for any other points that would support that? Do you remember being asked that before lunch?
Yes.
And do you remember that we stopped, but are there other points that corroborated that statement?
Yes.
May we approach?
You may.
Ma'am, one of the things that you were asked about on direct examination with regard to this issue of stalking, you were asked whether or not the scales indicated or were titled aggression. Do you remember that? You were asked questions about the MMPI involving the aggression and whether or not it was elevated, right?
Correct.
And you were in it, you indicated, and many questions were asked, well, isn't it below the threshold? Do you remember being asked about that, right?
Yes.
With regard to this issue of aggression as it applies to this stalking behavior, did you see, for example, involving the defendant, any indication from any other points involving stalking where there was some aggressive behavior?
You're speaking outside of the MMPI?
Outside of the MMPI, correct?
Well, there was an...
Objection, Judge, beyond the scope outside the MMPI.
Overruled.
Go ahead.
In terms of the stalking behavior, there was indication that she had gone into his Facebook account numerous...
Objection, Judge, this is beyond the scope. This is regard to aggression only.
Sustained.
Any indications, for example, that she did anything aggressive as part of this stalking behavior that she may have engaged in?
In terms of... I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit confused with the line of questioning.
Pardon?
I'm getting a little bit confused with the line of questioning.
You indicated with regard to the MMPI in response to question that there was this aggressive behavior
Yes.
scale. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And that was low in aggression, right?
Yes.
With regard to any aggressive behavior as it applies to stalking, did you see any behavior that you would characterize as aggressive that involved also stalking? Did you see any of that?
I would characterize what I just highlighted, that going into someone's account several times without their permission would be intrusive and aggressive.
So that's one. Anything else?
Yes, theft, stealing his ring.
Objection, this characterizes the evidence.
Sustained.
Anything else with regard to, well, Judge, may we approach on that? Ma'am, with regard to the ring issue, is it true, yes or no, that the defendant took Mr. Alexander's ring, yes or no?
Yes.
What other indications did you see with regard to aggressive behavior on the part of the defendant as they apply or indicate to you that there's also a component of stalking associated with them?
There was an indication that some emails were deleted.
Objection, Judge, beyond the scope.
Overruled.
And who deleted these emails?
It was, Ms. Arias was accused of doing that.
Objection, this characterizes the evidence. No proof.
Approach.
source of the deleted emails? What was the source of your deleted emails?
It was in written communication
Between whom?
with Miss Arias.
And I know, but Ms. Arias was involved in communication with somebody, right?
Mr. Alexander.
And that's the conversations that they had back and forth between each other, correct?
Yes.
And we've talked about, for example, text messages that were involved. They were also between Mr. Alexander and Ms. Arias, correct?
Yes.
Is there any reason to believe, for example, that if you have this exhibit, let's just take 445, where they're talking about it's always something, Jodi, it just gets old. Is there any reason to believe that this one is more true than the one involving the emails?
No, they're all written communication.
And it's written communications between the two of them, correct?
Yes.
You were asked about, well, this issue about whether or not you were an expert and the licensing that's involved. And the question yesterday and today involved the definition of expert. What is your definition? And yesterday you did indicate to the defense attorney that it depended on the definition, correct?
Yes.
So what is your definition of an expert?
The definition I was going off of was in terms of licensure. As I indicated when the question was first asked, I indicated that I was an expert as a clinical psychologist because that's what my license is in.
And with regard to the state of Arizona, does it offer any special licensing or any special certificate designating anybody, for example, an expert in domestic violence?
No.
Do they have, for example, licensing or certificates involving the area of post-traumatic stress disorder?
No.
Does the state of Arizona offer any special certificates with regard to anything other than being a clinical psychologist?
For psychologists, no.
And in this particular case, does the state of Arizona grandfather people in, or does it allow people, for example, who have been practicing, let's say 30, 35 years, to say, for example, I'm an expert in domestic violence because of the years that I've been spending in that area?
No, it just, again, depends on who's defining expert.
And with regard to your experience, you've already discussed what your experience is with regard to domestic violence, right?
Yes.
And in this particular case, you referenced a work, didn't you? What was the name of the book that you referenced?
By Lenore Walker?
That's the only book you referenced yesterday,
Yes.
isn't it?
Yes.
Is there any other book that you referenced yesterday?
No.
And in that book, you indicated there was certain criteria, right?
Yes.
What year was that book published?
It was 2009.
And in that, there was some criteria there, correct?
Yes.
And is that criteria still valid today?
Yes.
And what was that criteria?
The criteria was laid out for being able to identify someone who has battered women's syndrome. The first three criteria are associated with the three domains of PTSD: re-experiencing, avoidance, and high arousal. And then there's three more criteria: disturbed interpersonal relationships as a result of the batterer's power and control, sexual intimacy issues, and body image issues. Those are the 6 criteria.
And there's 6 criteria for what?
Battered women's syndrome.
And in this case, do you have an opinion as to whether or not, given everything that you've reviewed, the defendant has battered women's syndrome?
She does not meet that criteria. She does not have battered women's syndrome.
Why doesn't she meet that criteria?
There are numerous indicators that suggest that she does not fall into the criteria, such as I highlighted yesterday.
Give me you talked about the 6 criteria. What are we talking about?
We talked about the 3 related to PTSD, the tendency to re-experience the trauma, the tendency to avoid indications of the trauma. If there was any kind of avoidance, for example, we wouldn't see any writing in the journals, going to the memorial, going to his house after the memorial, indications like that.
And one of the things that you were asked about was the amount of money that you make in this particular case.
Yes.
Are you in charity work? Is that why you went to school to become a psychologist?
No.
And are you aware of anybody, for example, do you know whether or not Dr. Samuels charged for his services?
I'm assuming he did.
And how about Alice LaViolette? Do you know whether or not she charged?
Again, I'm assuming she did.
Ma'am, there were also some questions that were asked about you with regard to your CV. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And you were asked, well, you didn't list every single thing that you'd done. For example, you didn't list places or speeches that you had given. Do you remember being asked about that?
Yes.
And you indicated that you didn't do that. Why don't you do that with regard to every single little speech that you give?
Most of my time is compromised in seeing patients and doing evaluations, and I get called in to do things like that, and afterwards I rush to get to another appointment with a patient. And while I think those speaking engagements are important, I rarely use my CV for anything other than things like this, so it's not something that's salient to me and as important as treating my patients.
And with regard, are you familiar with what is known as padding your CV? Do you know what that is?
Yes.
I mean, that's a term that you used yesterday. What did you mean by that?
If I put down everything that I did, my CV would be really big. If I put down every single type of client I worked with, every diagnosis, every evaluation that I did, it would be a very large CV. And I don't see a purpose in doing that.
So what's wrong with a CD with, I don't know, 100 pages?
I don't know who would be interested in reading it, and I also just simply don't have the time to do that.
The other thing that you were asked about, ma'am, was these tests that were administered. Do you remember that?
Yes.
What were the and one of the tests that was administered was the TSI, and you were asked about that, right?
Yes,
Who administered the TSI?
I did.
And what was the reason that you administered the TSI?
I initially decided to give the TSI because a previous evaluator named Dr. Karp had administered the TSI.
And what does the TSI do? What is that test about?
It's the trauma symptom inventory. It's a measure of exposure to trauma and just general emotional negative psychological experiences.
We've seen some that have the bubble sheet, and we've seen some where you fill in kind of the blank. What kind of test is that?
It's the same thing. It's a self-report measure where the person speaks about their own experiences.
So do you write something out, or do you fill in the bubble sheet?
I give them the questions and the bubble sheet, and they complete it on their own.
So there are responses that they can pick from then, correct?
Yes.
How many questions are involved in that?
On the TSI, there's 100.
And what did that tell you? Instead of looking at the graphs, what is it that told you?
There was a number of different elevations on that test that was consistent with what Dr. Cart found. When you see a number of elevations like that, I went back and I specifically asked her where these kind of symptoms came from, because remember, post-traumatic stress disorder is associated with specific trauma. I followed up with that. There seemed to be a number of different factors that contributed to these elevations.
So let me stop you there. You said there was elevations. Elevations in what areas? That seems like we're talking up, hold on, in the sky. I want to know in what areas they were elevated.
For example, depression, anxiety, intrusive thoughts, identity.
And so if you have elevations in those areas, what are they related to? Wouldn't that be important to know what these elevations are related to?
Yes.
And what, in terms of her responses, are they related to? Or did she indicate they were related to?
To a number of different factors throughout her life, such as intrusive experiences, or excuse me, intrusive thoughts. She said that she had thoughts about her childhood, about positive memories, negative memories, a number of different factors.
What else? I mean, you listed 4 factors, and then you're just giving us 1 or 2 indications of that. Why don't you go ahead and give us the 4 factors that were elevated again?
Well, there were several factors that were elevated.
All right, give us the ones that were elevated.
May I reference my notes?
Sure, go ahead.
I've already highlighted anxiety and depression.
Excuse me?
I've already highlighted the anxiety and depression.
All right, let me stop you there with regard to the anxiety. So they're elevated. That really doesn't seem to say anything other than, for example, depression. She's in jail. Wouldn't you expect somebody that's in jail to have that elevated? Yes or no?
Yes.
Objection is characterized as the TSI. And foundation, there are 2 TSIs.
you were asked about the TSI, correct?
Correct.
How many periods did the TSI look at?
When I administered it,
Yes.
I administered it twice.
Right, but which periods is what I'm asking.
One was from January of 2007 to January of 2008. The other was within the last 6 months.
All right, how about the one that went from January 7th, 2007 to January 7th of 2008? Drawing your attention to that one, was there an elevation on the anxiety scale?
Yes.
And what in her answers supported this elevated anxiety?
Her item response.
Pardon?
Her item response. There's a number of different items that would cause that scale to be elevated.
And can you speak specific about what it was that she said that she had this anxiety about?
I don't have specifics of that.
Okay, how about this depression? Do we know what she was depressed about?
She indicated that it was related to a number of different factors.
Such as what?
One of the things that she highlighted was that she had thoughts about her relationship with Mr. Juarez.
And those elevated scales on the TSI at the time period that you were asked about, how are they related to whether or not that is PTSD or borderline personality disorder? Does that help you or not help you?
Well, an elevation in all those different scales, it could be indicative of PTSD, and it also could be indicative of borderline personality disorder. The way that I was able to differentiate it was by going back and asking follow-up questions about what were the exact traumas that then led to an elevation of these scales. And as I highlighted, there's a number of different areas. And furthermore, when you see elevations, several elevations on the TSI, it's also indicative of people with borderline personality disorder.
You said there was a number of areas that she indicated, that she highlighted for you, that you talked to her about. What are those areas?
The areas are the scales.
Or the scale? No, you said, well, you went back and you clarified
Yes.
and you talked to her and she indicated there were a number of areas. What areas are we talking about?
We talked about stress related to being incarcerated, thoughts about the crime, thoughts about her frustration with the process of working with her family and with her attorneys in preparing for the process of trial. There was a number of different stressors that she highlighted.
Yes.
Ma'am, with regard to the test involving the first period,
Okay.
involving the elevated scales on the first test for the first period,
Okay.
in whether or not that gave you an indication as to whether or not it was PTSD or borderline personality disorder. Were there any indications there that it could be either, both, or neither?
The high elevations indicated that it could be borderline personality disorder
And why is that as opposed to post-traumatic stress disorder?
for the exact reasons that I just highlighted. That
I understand that they were the exact reasons you just highlighted, but if you could just tell me what the reasons are.
There was a lot of distress around her sexual intimacy with Mr. Alexander. Two of the scales on the TSI are related to sexual, being sexually content, feeling sexually comfortable. She had indicated to me that that caused significant distress because it was against what she believed to be appropriate with the religion of being Mormon.
And so you've told us all of that, but how does that tell us that that's, or tell you, that that's borderline personality disorder as opposed to post-traumatic stress disorder?
What this suggests to me is, since there's a number of different areas that are elevated, is that there's general emotional distress there. And that's commonly seen in the literature, that if you have high elevations across all the scales, that that's commonly seen in individuals with borderline personality disorder.
You were also asked about the MCMI. Do you remember being asked questions about that?
Yes,
With regard to the MCMI, how many questions is that? Do you know?
I believe it's 175.
And with regard to this particular test, who is it normed against?
A clinical population.
What does that mean, that it is normed against a clinical population? What is it that the test is looking at when you say it's normed against a clinical population?
Anytime you take a test, we have to make a decision of what the test means. So we have to compare the test taker scores to something else. A clinical population would mean that we were comparing Miss Arias' scores to individuals who already had been engaged in treatment, whether it be inpatient treatment like hospitalization or outpatient treatment, such as seeing a therapist weekly.
And so how does that affect whether or not one makes a decision as to whether or not it's PTSD or borderline personality disorder?
Well, in terms of the test, the sensitivity is just, it's lowered because you're comparing patient against potentially patient rather than what is a deviation from a normative sample, a typical person. That helps us decide whether there is a presence of a psychological diagnosis or not.
Did that assist you in any way in making a determination as to whether or not it was PTSD or borderline personality disorder?
Both of those fell below the threshold.
So, and looking at that, any indications in your mind as to it was suggestive of either borderline personality disorder or something else?
No, it was in supportive of either.
And with regard to Dr. Samuels, you read his report, right?
Yes.
Were there any indications about whether or not, after administering these tests, whether or not he had an opinion as to whether or not a personality disorder may be involved in this diagnosis of the defendant?
Yes, in his report, he indicated that on Axis 2, which again is the area that we put personality disorders, he indicated that, that she had personality disorder, what's called NOS, not otherwise specified.
So what does that mean in terms of its connection with borderline personality disorder?
Well, it suggests that there's the presence of problematic personality traits. Personality disorder, NOS, is what we consider the junk kind of category, in that the person is displaying signs of a personality disorder, but just happens to not fit nicely into one specific disorder. And that was according to this test.
So according to which test, the MCMI?
That's how it was listed in his report, yes.
And in his report to him, there was an indication that there was this personality disorder not otherwise specified, correct?
Yes.
The other issue with regard to the testing, you were asked about the PDS. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And you were asked about the writings on the PDS, about the trauma that was suffered or that was indicated in one of the questions after question number 14. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And she answered, according to what you indicated to us, that the trauma that was associated with this test involved trauma by or an event involving two individuals, correct?
Yeah.
Objection beyond, mischaracterizes the evidence.
Correct?
Yes.
And you previously indicated that, in your belief, that was untruthful, correct?
Yes.
And based on the fact that that was untruthful, if that was an untruth, what would it do to the rest of the responses involving the PDS?
It completely invalidates it.
Why? Why would it invalidate the PDS?
Because on the PDS, all the subsequent symptoms are associated with the trauma that was highlighted earlier in the questionnaire. She highlighted earlier in the questionnaire that the trauma was related to people, I think it was labeled non-stranger, or stranger, excuse me. And so she indicated that that was the trauma that she was focusing on when filling out the subsequent questions.
So what does that do to the validity of her responses involving the PDS?
It's completely invalid.
And is that something that can be used to support the finding that she is somebody who can be diagnosed with PTSD?
It can't be used for anything.
Why can't it be used for anything?
It's a completely invalid test. She lied on it.
Objection.
Okay, okay.
Go ahead.
And all the subsequent questions were based on something that didn't exist.
You were also asked today about the MMPI. Do you remember being asked about that?
Yes.
and you were being asked about a number of scales, and you indicated that, well, some of them you used and some of them you didn't use. The ones that you didn't use, first, you indicated there was 2 of them that you didn't use, correct?
2 larger categories, yes.
Right. What was the first category?
Of the ones that I didn't use,
That is correct.
I believe they're called the restructured scales.
And with regard to the restructured scales, why didn't you use them? They were there, right?
They were.
Why didn't you use them?
I've never used them. It's typical practice to not use it. I'm sure there's some psychologists out there that may use it. It just doesn't have as much empirical support as all the other scales were, and it's important to me to be as accurate as possible, so I want to use the measures that have the most empirical support.
When you talk about empirical support, what are you talking about?
Research backing.
So they're included, but in your experience, they don't have enough research backing. What does that mean?
It means that there's potential for them not to be as accurate. So I don't want to rely on something that's not as accurate.
What about the other scales or the other structures that you didn't use?
I don't recall even the name of them. I don't use them.
And would you, with regard to the ones that you did use, why did you use those?
That's what's commonly done in practice. Those are the 3 primary scale scores that are used.
And something that may be commonly used in practice, that may be so, but couldn't that be wrong? In other words, why is it that you're relying on something that's commonly used? Have you received any education that indicates to you that those are the ones to use?
Consistently, this is what most psychologists use. And in my educational experience, that's what we're trained to do.
And so you looked at those and you saw that some of the peaks and the valleys that are involved in there seem to suggest that there wasn't any borderline personality disorder there, correct?
No.
Or did it suggest to you or indicate to you that there was borderline personality disorder?
Those scales do suggest that there's a presence of borderline personality disorder.
Tell me about that. Why do you say that?
Sure. So when you talked about the lows on them, on the MMPI, you don't interpret things below the threshold. You interpret above. There's very few scores or scales that you actually interpret below. In terms of the peaks, as I highlighted earlier, when you see that many that are elevated above 65, that's very meaningful. That indicates that there's this emotional turmoil that's consistent with borderline personality disorder.
Why isn't it post-traumatic stress disorder instead of borderline personality?
Well, one of the features that was highlighted earlier, one of the scales was post-traumatic stress disorder that was elevated. An important part of that scale is that, again, it doesn't link it back to a specific trauma. The interpretation of that is that there's a lot of negative emotional turmoil. There's a feeling like you're out of control. That's the interpretation of the post-traumatic stress disorder scale.
And you were asked about a instant messaging or message that was on May 26th of 2008. Do you remember being asked about that?
Yes.
And you indicated, well, there is some inappropriate language there, correct?
Yes.
And you also indicated that even though there is a pattern inside of this particular message, you indicated that you didn't see a pattern throughout. What were you talking about?
I reviewed a lot of written exchanges between Mr. Alexander and Ms. Arias. There were certainly times where Mr. Alexander used unhealthy language, as highlighted before. This was something that happened infrequently and typically happened in times when he was upset about.
Overruled.
It was in times where he felt lied to, betrayed, or.
Judge, may we approach?
You indicated that at times Mr. Alexander said felt lied to. Can you give us the specific example where he felt like that he was lied to?
There were numerous there were several written communications between the two of them where he indicated that she was lying about something, that he wrote and called her a liar for engaging in various behaviors.
And so when you say that, does that indicate to you that there isn't a pattern with regard to this name calling or use of inappropriate language?
The only pattern that was there was that he tended to respond in that manner in times when his privacy was invaded, when he felt like she was being untruthful with him. When he felt like she wasn't being truthful, he reacted in that way. On a day-to-day basis, they had a lot of communication with each other, a lot of text messages, a lot of IMs, a lot of emails. There was no indication that he used this kind of verbiage on a regular basis outside of these situations.
You were also shown Exhibit 511, and there's an indication that, and you were asked about, but it still remains that I cannot marry him. I can't quite put my finger on it, but something is just off with that boy. Well, we all got head problems, that's for sure, right?
Yes.
It says that. But there are certain things that will never sit right with me. And then it says about, doesn't it?
Yes.
But there's more to it than that, right? It talks about him, right? And then it gives the examples of what she says is wrong with him, right?
Yes.
Overruled.
And if you can read it, if not, I'll have to give it to you. What does it say?
For example, he always makes that ridiculous joke, families can be forever. Why do you want to spend so much time with them now? Can you pull it back so that I could read it all at once?
There you go. Can you read it now?
I can't read what that word says. I
How about I and then abhor? Can you see that?
abhor that. I want a family man.
What else? Go ahead.
Keep going. A man who takes family seriously. I know he jokes, but that drives me crazy, and it's a big turnoff. But he has told me time again that if he could marry me, it would mean he won the wife lottery. That's sweet, actually.
And so when you are just shown portions of this particular item, it seems to indicate that she's saying there's something wrong with him, right?
Yes.
But then she also explains it. You were asked whether or not it was borderline personality disorder or whether or not it was PTSD.
Yes.
And we previously talked about it. So this is what was discussed. You indicated that the first item involving borderline personality disorder was an effort to avoid real or imagined abandonment. And you were asked about that. Does she meet that criteria? Yes or no?
Yes.
Give me the examples that you believe show that she meets that criteria of borderline personality disorder instead of post-traumatic stress disorder.
She had a strong desire to maintain relationships. She would engage in behaviors that, again, to an outsider may be questionable as to how this would keep someone from abandoning them. For example, she was found hiding behind a Christmas tree. She would...
Scope and mischaracterized as not in evidence.
Approach, please.
You were talking to us about an indication about her being near or a Christmas tree. Tell me about that.
That she was found hiding behind a Christmas tree
Whose Christmas tree?
at Mr. Alexander's house.
All right. Any other examples of these efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment?
She would show up unannounced repeatedly.
Would that create problems between her and Mr. Alexander?
Yes.
Anything else?
There were,
As it applies to this efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment.
there's indications that this occurred in previous relationships also.
And for example, what are you talking about?
For example, her relationship with Matt McCartney.
Yes?
There was indication in the records that he tried to end the relationship before she was willing to allow that to happen. In fact, he had already moved on, was dating someone else who she later confronted.
Objection, mischaracterizes the evidence.
Overruled.
Now, ma'am, there's also number 2, unstable and intense interpersonal relationships. Again, briefly tell us what that is and the elements or the aspects of the defendant's behavior that qualify her for this borderline personality disorder symptom.
It's a tendency to have disrupted interpersonal relationships due to the tendency to either idealize someone or devalue them, and have a tendency to switch between the two.
Let me ask you with regard to Exhibit 511. In the first part of it, she's talking about there's something wrong with that boy. Do you see that?
Yes.
Then in the second portion about that, she talks about, I want to be married, and then says, Travis is awesome, no doubt. And she says something about that. Is that the kind of thing that you are talking about, where she says something good and then says something bad? Or or am I not giving you the accurate?
Yeah, I wouldn't use that as an example. Let me provide a better example of it.
Go ahead.
For example, after the memorial service, the records indicated that on the plane ride home, Miss Arias exchanged phone numbers with another male, who she then called right when she came home after Mr. Alexander's memorial service. That would be an example to show that at that point there was a devaluing, a despising, that someone who had just lost someone who was very close to them was able to engage in a courting behavior like that right after the memorial service.
Objection, assumes facts not evidence, courting behavior.
Overruled.
How about identity disturbance? Again, briefly, what is that? And how does the defendant manifest the symptom?
I've talked a lot about identity disturbance, not having a strong core sense of who you are. There's indication that that has been present throughout her adolescence and throughout adulthood. An example that I found in the records was her tendency to change herself to fit into different environments, her tendency to change the way she looked because she thought that an ex-boyfriend would prefer that, such as getting implants and changing the color of her hair.
Does the fact that she became a member of the LDS faith after 2 months, is that indicative of an identity disturbance issue or not?
It's another data point that suggests that she very quickly changed her religious views and intensely became involved with the Mormon church shortly after becoming a member.
Suicidal behavior and ideation. There was this talk about threats and that sort of thing. Explain that to us as it applies to the issue of threat or non-threat.
Having suicidal ideation is thinking about it, thinking about what it would be like, talking about it. That's different from a threat, which is, I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to take some pills and I'm going to kill myself.
Does that prong or that aspect of the diagnosis require an actual planning or an actual threat, or does it require something else?
No, it doesn't require an actual threat. We're just looking at ideation. Is this person frequently thinking about harming themselves?
And was she frequently thinking about suicide?
So there was notations of that throughout the records.
How about affective instability?
Again, the records were replete with comments about her tendency to go up and down very quickly. Emotional ability, as a reminder, is that emotional roller coaster that I talked about before. Quick changing emotions based on environmental stressors. So, for example, someone dropping their keys on the floor instead of getting a little bit upset about it, getting really emotionally upset about it, that quick change in emotions.
All right, well, how did the defendant manifest that?
All of her romantic partners indicated that they saw this in her, that this was a common thing. A tendency to be dramatic was an adjective that was frequently used in describing her. You could see it in her journal entries that went from happy to sad very quickly.
Feelings of emptiness. How does she manifest that?
Again, I specifically asked her about this idea of feeling empty. She indicated that this has been a characteristic that has been stable throughout her life, just feeling like there's nothing there, this tendency of feeling completely empty inside.
And there's inappropriate, intense anger. What is that?
Just as it indicates that there's this tendency to feel really angry and upset.
Is this related to something like the February 14th, 2007 email where she talked about the destruction involving the door, the window, that sort of thing, or is this something different?
Something like that, and also there was indication in her journal where she indicated that she just has so much hate inside of her.
Well, didn't we also see some scales that indicated that the anger was low? Do you remember seeing those?
Yes,
And which test was that?
that was on the MMPI.
And doesn't that speak against what you have there?
What I was trying to explain before is that the name of the actual scale doesn't always go along with the interpretation. As I described before with PTSD, there's other scales on the MMPI that have a component of aggressiveness and anger in them. And there are two of those scales that she elevated on.
Objection, Foundation.
Sustained.
So, ma'am, how does that, again, how do you reconcile this intense anger versus what you saw?
On the MMPI?
Yes.
That there is some indication that she has some anger problems, that she had some strong feelings of anger internally.
And again,
Objection, Foundation, as to which scales?
Sustained.
which scales are we talking about?
May I reference my
Sure.
notes? Supplementary supplementary scales, excuse me. There's a component within the addiction admission scale and addiction potential scale.
And now that we have the scales, how do the numbers or the elevations in those scales, how do they, if you will, correspond or not correspond with this inappropriate, intense anger that is indicated in somebody that has borderline personality disorder?
They suggest that there is some evidence of aggressiveness and anger inside, internal anger.
This May 26, 2008 email that was referred where the victim, where Mr. Alexander does use some words that you classified as inappropriate, correct?
Yes.
And you also talked about a pattern of, not behavior, but a pattern in these particular items as it involves the interaction between the defendant and Mr. Alexander, correct?
Yes.
And in this particular item, can you walk us through it, showing us what the defendant did or said as part of this, and how Mr. Alexander responded involving these words?
Sure. May I have the...
Sure, take a look at it. Read it and then let me know when you're done reading it. Are you done reviewing it?
Yes.
Walk me through it.
So it's another situation where he was upset about her invading his privacy.
And as a result of that, the conversation continued.
Yes.
And when he first started this conversation, did he use this language that has been posed to you about the words whore, that sort of thing?
He was very stern at the beginning.
But was he using those words in the beginning?
Not at the beginning.
And then what happened after the conversation continued?
It escalated. He asked her to be truthful.
And was she truthful about it?
Objection, speculation.
In the view of this May 26, 2008 document, in his view, as he continued to escalate, did he believe she was being truthful?
Objection, speculation.
No.
And so what happened then?
They continued to argue and talk about it.
Did he make disparaging remarks about himself? Such as being nothing more than a dildo with a heartbeat?
Yes.
Did he also make disparaging comments about her?
Yes.
And then did it escalate to some of these names that were being called?
Yes.
And is that character assassination?
Using those words to impact your character, it could be considered that, yes.
But just because they are character assassination, does that mean that there's a pattern that they have dealing with each other in this way? Or is it just a pattern in this particular argument or the arguments that they had?
Related to those incidents where they had these exchanges.
And is this a pattern of abuse involving all of these conversations, or is that just a pattern inside of this particular conversation?
Objection goes beyond the scope of her expertise with regard to domestic violence.
Oh, really?
It was a pattern within those conversations, not across time.
And other than the defendant's statements about the physical, according to her, those 4 physical issues of violence, were there any other issues that she described of violence other than the 4 to you?
No.
And also you were able to review the instant messages and the text messages, were you?
Yes.
And as a result of that, do you have an opinion as to whether or not she was the victim of abuse?
Objection goes beyond the scope.
Approach, please.
Based on these conversations and the conversations with the defendant, was she the victim of abuse?
There was not a pattern that suggested that she was a victim of abuse.
So your answer is no.
Right.
I don't have anything else, thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 10-minute recess. If you have any questions for this witness, please leave them in the basket. Please remember the admonition. You are excused.
Please stand for the jury.
The record will show the jury has left the courtroom. We are at recess. You may step down.